Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Daniels, and I'm the program leader for Indiana Native Seed Communities, which is a project of the Indiana Native Plant Society. Also tonight, helping is Deb Housen, and she'll be lending her skills, her skills in the presentation on helping with the technical aspects and also the questions. So we welcome you tonight. I'm very glad you've joined us for Ian Caton's presentation, Seed Sowing and Propagation, an Introduction to Growing Your Own Native Plants. Before I introduce Ian, I'd like to share with you some information about Indiana Native Seed Communities. We promote networks of native plant enthusiasts working together regionally to procure, to process, to propagate native plant seeds, to increase the presence of these beautiful and ecologically appropriate native plants in all of our landscapes. We have a lot of resources on our Indiana Native Plant Society's website and social media that we'll share links with you in the chat here in a little while. A few notes before we get to Ian's presentation. For the best experience, if you please keep yourself muted, unless, of course, you're invited to unmute. Also, if you have any questions, put those in the chat, and Deb, as I mentioned, will be fielding those questions. That we will hold off, though, to present the questions to Ian at the end of his presentation. But go ahead and put those in the chat, and Deb will take care of that a little while later. Okay, well, let's go ahead and introduce Ian. Ian Caton has been the owner-operator of Wood Thrush Native Plant Nursery, formerly Enchanter's Garden, in Floyd, Virginia, since 2013. Wood Thrush Native Plants is a nursery specializing in plants of the Appalachian region, including West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and North Carolina. A focus of the nursery is the introduction of new and rare native plants that are little known or underappreciated in the nursery trade. Ian previously worked for Larry Weiner Landscape Associates, a firm specializing in the use and promotion of native plants in landscaping, and has an ongoing relationship with its educational arm, New Directions in American Landscape. And that's where I actually first heard Ian speak. So I'm very happy to now give you Ian Caton.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share here. All right. So yeah, I'm going to kind of walk through my process and my thoughts on collecting, cleaning, and storing native seeds, as well as strategies for sowing and other propagation strategies. I guess I'll just jump right in here, starting with collecting. And this is my collecting kit. I like to have a bag with assortments of various things. So I like to have plastic bags. I have plenty of paper envelopes. I even bring old medicine bottles. I find old medicine bottles to be actually really good and useful storage devices for certain seeds. Make sure that I always make sure I have a Sharpie and a pencil, because you can't write on a plastic bag with a pencil. And I like to reuse my envelopes, so I like to use a pencil on the envelopes. The paper there you see is actually, and I always carry bottled water. It's my special bottled water just for seed collecting or for plant collecting. Occasionally, I will find a situation where I may want to take cuttings, in which case I will wet the paper and wrap up the cuttings and put them in a plastic bag for to bring back to the nursery. I don't do that as often, but it does happen from time to time. I'll see a very unusual bee balm, or which here in the Appalachians, I find strange looking bee balms fairly often, and I will often take a cutting or two of those plants to bring back to have at the nursery. Seed cleaning kit, very simple. The only real professional tool there are those geologic sieves. on the right-hand side. Those are sieves of various sizes, useful for processing different size seeds, leaving the chaff behind. You can get these online pretty easily. You can also make your own. In the background, you'll see some wooden frames. Those are just wooden frames with hardware cloth of various kinds tacked onto it. A hardware cloth and even a window screen works. And then the aluminum material in the lower left corner, that's just an aluminum mixing bowl and some aluminum pizza pans and a piece of aluminum flashing that I bent into a little funnel. And that's the extent of what I use for processing. I don't have any fancy machines or anything like that, but it works for me on the smaller scale seed collecting, cleaning, and processing that I tend to do. Other things that I like to have for myself and for the people who work for me when they're cleaning, dust masks. When you're processing some of these seeds, often it will throw up very fine hairs and dust that you don't want to breathe in. So I will usually have them wear a mask if that's a problem. And some of these things actually have strong allergens, even if they're not typically allergen prone plants. When you're working with them closely and pushing them around on a metal mesh, I find some people with a particularly sensitive skin will get hives on their hands. So gloves, good gloves are actually very important to have as well. Bags, the way that I do most of the seeds that I'm actually going to dry, and I'll talk about the difference between dry storage and wet storage in a moment. But I do a lot of, at this time of year, most seeds that I'm collecting are dry seeds that I'm going to dry store until I'm ready to actually sow them into flats. And to dry them down, I'll just put them in a grocery bag in the well labeled. Make sure that your bags are labeled. I can't tell you how many times, and it happened again this year that a bag got either not labeled and I couldn't remember what it was, or it had an old label on it that no one remembered to cross out. So again, no one quite remembered what was in the bag. And I just dry them in the greenhouse, but you can also dry them in a shed or any old area that gets dry. You want it to be a dry location with plenty of air circulation so that the plants don't mold. All right, some storage and sowing considerations. So seeds generally come in two storage possibilities. They either need to be, you can either store them dry or you can sow them, or I'm not sow, I mean, you can either store them dry or they have to be stored wet. Seeds that have to be stored wet are usually those that are coming from wet bodies, that is fruit or moist capsules or something like that. A lot of things like pawpaws and persimmons and blueberries and amelanchier and things like that. If you collect those seeds and dry them, they will either lose viability or they will go into a deeper dormancy from which they take much longer to recover if they ever recover. So generally, if you are collecting seeds from a fruit of some kind, those seeds cannot be allowed to dry out. They have to be stored wet. And I will show you some of my wet storage things. So dry, if the seeds are generally dry on the plant when you're collecting them, you can store them dry in various ways. Other considerations when you are collecting and storing seeds is how big are the seeds? If you collect a plant that has lots and lots of small seeds and put it in an envelope, I have found the seeds will just leak out of the corners of the envelope. So you have to be aware that some seeds are so small that they will leak out of envelopes and you'll need to put them into something else. That's where the medicine bottles come in. I like to put really tiny dusty seeds in medicine bottles. Ideally glass bottles though. Another thing about small seeds is they actually often have a high rate of static. And in a plastic bottle or a plastic bag, they'll stick to the bag and they'll get hard to get out again. I actually found some old glass test tubes. I live near a university and they were throwing away a bunch of glass test tubes, and I just snatched them up and I used them with stoppers, and they make great seed storage. Um, so clean seeds and seeds that need to be cleaned. That basically means that some seeds, when you collect them, you don't have to do anything with them. They can go right into your long-term storage container. And other seeds you've got to process in some way. Those are just some other considerations to take when you're um, when you got your storage materials together. Some seeds can be stored for a long period of time, but other seeds need to be sown immediately, even dry seeds. Um, and a lot of those come down to seeds that need to be sown in the summertime, and those are seeds that ripen in the spring and summer. And I'll talk about that in a future slide as well. And also dormancy requirements. Another mistake I think a lot of people make is they don't realize how long some of these plants can take to germinate. And I don't just mean that they might take a couple of years. Um, pawpaw seeds often for me don't germinate till June. And I know I've talked to people who have given up on their pawpaw seeds because they didn't germinate in April or May, and they won't. In my experience, pawpaw seeds germinate late. And I found that to be the case with any number of seed plants, especially big seeded things, often come up very late in the season. So here's some storage things in the upper left-hand corner. Of course, my medicine bottles and coin envelopes, great for dry storage. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see I've got plastic jars of various kinds, medicine bottles again, which are also good for wet storage, and plastic bags. And the other thing about those wet stored seeds is that you need to pack them in a medium that is good for the seed, like wet sand or even a little bit of wet potting soil, or wet sawdust or a wet paper towel even. And I usually judge what medium to use based on the size of the seed. For instance, if you have very, very small seeds and put those small seeds in sand, you'll never be able to separate them from the sand. You'll have to sow the sand along with the seed. So sand is great for packing things like persimmons and pawpaw seeds into. But for small, tiny seeds, either I need to use a very, very small amount of sand so that I can easily sow the seed with the sand, or I'll actually put this very small seeds in sandwiched in a moist paper towel or a moist blotting paper, from which I can retrieve them more easily later on. The lower left-hand corner is just a big bin. I usually recommend people that they store their bulk seed storage, all their envelopes, all their things, put them in a bin because I've had so many of them get destroyed by mice, raccoons, squirrels, all kinds of things. So you got to have a sealed container if you're not storing, if you're storing them in a barn or a shed or something like that. And a refrigerator, a lot of the seeds that I'm putting in those wet bags, I'm then putting in the refrigerator. So my refrigerator crisper is full of little bags of pawpaw seeds and persimmon seeds and various other things that have to go into a wet substrate. And I put those things in the refrigerator pretty quickly because if I leave them out warm, they usually get moldy more quickly. So I generally recommend that as soon as they go into a moist bag, they go right in the refrigerator. Some thoughts on size. When I talk about big seeds, this is kind of about the size I'm thinking of. I mean, big for small seeds, that is. I'm not talking about like pawpaw seeds or acorns or anything like that. But Baptisia, Thalictrum, things like that, these are generally on the bigger size spectrum. Rudbeckia and Heliopsis, these are like medium seeds. You can still put seeds like this into a paper envelope and they won't leak out of the corners of the envelope. You can put them into a plastic bag and they generally won't stick to the sides of the plastic bag. But this stuff, lobelia, juncus, the really tiny, tiny seeds, put them in a plastic bag and they practically live in the bag from now on. It's hard to get them back out of the bag. You put them in an envelope and they leak out of the envelope. So you need a more secure storage material for this kind of seed. I mentioned moist seeds before. Here's just another example of a thing that comes, this is the fruit of the American bittersweet. If you collect this seed, you have to extract the seed from the fruit. Most fruits have germination inhibitors in them. So if you actually sow the fruit without cleaning it, not only does that attract things that might dig it up, but they actually contain germination inhibitors that can slow the germination of the seeds. So extract the seeds from the fruit. These seeds are fairly large, so you can pack it right into some wet sand, put them in a sandwich bag, put it right into the refrigerator. Stuff that's fluffy. Some people talk, some of this fluff can be removed with a lot of effort and elbow grease. I generally don't go through the effort to remove the kind of fluff from some of these seeds. So when you have fluffy seed like that, you have to plan for it. You'll need a bigger envelope. And I actually have big manila envelopes that I use for these kinds of things. There's a very small amount of seed that has a great deal of fluff is going to fill one of those manila envelopes up pretty quickly. Let's see, this is a video. Let's see if it'll play. I have such mixed results getting these videos to play. Come on, play. All right, well, this was a demonstration of some of the other cleaning processes that I do with a sieve, but here's kind of some photos. This is actually Eriogonum allenii, one of the native buckwheats. And the hard nut-like seed is embedded in this paper. Now, this is a case where actually, even though I just said I don't generally remove a lot of the chaff from some seeds, especially fluffy chaff that's very hard to remove without a lot of effort, some things with the chaff come off very easily. And a little pressure on a sieve with this stuff pushes the nut-like seeds right through the mesh. The chaff mostly stays behind, and that chaff that does fall through is light, and I can just blow it right out of the bowl. Just a couple of puffs of breath will blow it right out of the bowl. And I'm left with just the pure Eriogonum seeds behind. That one, you see how pointy those seeds are? That is one where you really need to wear leather gloves when you're processing it, because you get those little spines sticking into your skin. It is not pleasant. So sometimes you never know. It's often best to err on the side of caution when you're not sure what kind of seed you're dealing with and how sharp and pointy and uncomfortable they're going to be. This is another case. Now, this isn't seed. These are lily bulbs, native lily bulbs, but some things you can treat like seed. So this is something that I do in August or September, about the same time I'm collecting seed, is that I will I'll bare root my lilies, and all those little lily bulbs have scales on them that I can prick off a certain amount of scales from each bulb. And that bowl on the top there is a bowl of lily scales. Those can be treated like seeds. I sow them just like they're seeds, and they will germinate in the spring, just like seeds do. So, sometimes there are things that behave like seeds that aren't seeds. Some native lilies produce aerial bulbs that you can collect, and they're not seeds either, but you can treat them like seeds. All right. This is where my discussion earlier about seeds that need to be sown more quickly, that you can't store for long periods of time, comes in. And a lot of these things are woodland plants. A lot of woodland plants produce fewer seeds than prairie or open, meadow plants. The seed often ripens irregularly on a lot of woodland plants. They ripen in little dribs and drabs, which makes it very hard to collect them. And it makes it easy for them to be lost You know, if they suddenly ripen and then drop overnight, you can't collect it anymore. So many of them you can only collect in small amounts at a time. You have to go out and visit the plant on a fairly regular basis over a matter of weeks to get enough seed to make it worthwhile. Many of these woodland seeds either have a low viability or they require special storage or have complex multi-year germination requirements. Often the case is with these woodland plants, especially the ones that bloom in the springtime, the seeds are ripening up in June, May or June, or even July. If you collect them and store them and sow them in the autumn, they will not do as well as if you had collected them and sown them in the summertime. I usually, as a rule of thumb, say seeds want to be in the soil or in the pots within a month or a month and a half of whenever you're collecting them. So if you collect bluebell seeds in May, you should sow them before July if you expect them to do well. Same with woodland phlox, same with many trillium species, but I'm thinking more specifically about the spring blooming flower plants that have dry seeds like Jacob's ladder, like spring phloxes. All of those plants, you collect them generally in May and June or even early July. You can store them dry for a very short period of time, but you need to sow them in the summertime. Otherwise, they won't do as well. Just for example, this is showy skullcap Scutellaria serrata. And this, you can see the on, I don't know if the cursor shows here, but on the right-hand side of that stem are the seed pods. And they ripen two at a time. And as soon as two of them are ripe, they drop off before the next two are ripe. So when I'm collecting this plant, I have to go out to it every day, and I will get 2 to 4 seeds a day. Which is very labor intensive. And it's one of the reasons why I don't collect this plant from any wild location, because that's a lot of driving. I really have as many plants as I possibly can on my own property in the nursery to collect from, and especially these plants that have finicky seed ripening times. So I can go out there every day just in my backyard and collect these seeds and get enough of them to make a difference. Spigelium marilandica, pink root. Now this is, I talked about serrata. When they ripen, the seeds just drop off the plant. Spigelium marilandica also tends to ripen their seeds 2 at a time. The moment 2 of them are ripe, the pod explodes and the seed goes who knows where. But unlike Scutellaria serrata, as soon as 2 of them are ripened, I know all the others are close enough that I can collect the whole thing. So even though Spigelia ripens in the same kind of way, it's actually a little bit easier for me to collect than the other one because it does tend to ripen everything a little bit closer together, so I can collect them all at the same time. Aristolochia serpentaria, the snake root, this is one that boggles me sometimes. Produces a ton of these little pods, and one day they're all there, and the next day they're all gone. And in the left-hand picture, you can see one of them that's split open. I'm lucky when I find them split open like that, because it usually means I can still collect the seeds off the soil surface. But these pods I found are often taken by white-footed mice or squirrels or something. And I'll often come out one morning and find that something has stripped them all away. So again, timing and dormancy. Things that are blooming in the spring and ripening in June or July, those seeds are ripening in June, July, you usually have to sow them pretty soon. They have to go through that summertime period. So you can think of their dormancy as not a cold dormancy, it's a warm, then cold dormancy. Things that bloom in the spring or summer or whenever, but when the seeds are ripening in the autumn, those seeds are often ripening all at the same time. They often hold on the plant for a long time, so you can collect them often well into the winter. and they can be stored dry often for a long period of time and sown anytime in the winter, as long as you can provide that cold dormancy period. So just for example, some examples of both. These are plants that are spring blooming, but spring to summer ripening seeds. So these are things that have to be collected and sown in the summertime. Camassia psiloides, the Atlantic camas. If you collect this is usually, this is another one of those ones where if you don't collect it, you'll lose it. The whole thing just disintegrates like overnight practically. So the moment I notice the plant being close to ripe, I'll collect it. The seeds are usually sown in the summertime. They start to germinate in the autumn, and then they'll produce the tops the next spring. Geranium maculatum, Mertensia virginica, that's the wild geranium, and Virginia bluebells. Similar, Jacob's ladder, white, blue wood phlox or Phlox divaricata. All of these plants, all spring blooming, they all have dry seed pods. They can all be collected and stored for a short period of time in an envelope dry, but you still need to sow them in the summertime. Don't wait till the autumn. And make sure you get them before you lose them. This is Phlox divaricata seed pods. You can see on the lower right corner of the picture a unbroken pod, and all the other pods on there are all missing. They've already dehissed and the seeds are gone. Antonaria and Peckera. These are windblown seeds. So again, you have to collect them again before they blow away, and you really need to sow them. They'll actually germinate in the autumn. It's not even the case that they have to go through a warm summer period, then a cold period. They actually just need to go through the summertime, and they'll germinate in September or October, usually. So this is a case where often I'm sowing them and collecting them and sowing them immediately for autumn propagation. Same with Chrysogonum virginianum. If anyone actually ever goes through the trouble and effort of collecting the seeds of this plant. I used to do this plant just through rooted cuttings. But then I found that actually collecting the seed of this plant is not that difficult if you're very vigilant. It is like a lot of these other spring plants where the seeds, as soon as they're ripe, will drop right off the plant. So you've got to collect them in little bits at a time. But if I sow them in the summertime, they actually germinate by the autumn, and I'll have a pretty decent number of plants by September, October. And it's now my preferred method of propagating this plant over rooted cuttings or division. Some plants that are summertime ripening but are moist and wet. Remember what I said about moist and wet seeds. You can never store them dry. So Sanguinaria canadensis, Actea pachypoda, all the trilliums, these things that produce moist capsules, they're technically capsules rather than fruits or berries. You collect them, but you have to sow them immediately, like that day. You cannot let them dry for a moment. If you do store them for any amount of time, then you do have to put them into a bag of wet sand and then put them in the refrigerator. In which case, I generally recommend not sowing them until the following February or so. Primula media, shooting star. Now, some plants that bloom in the spring, ripen in the summertime, you can store practically indefinitely and sow them anytime. So even though I said as a rule of thumb, you want to sow them within a month, month and a half of whenever you're collecting them, there are a few exceptions. There's always exceptions, of course. Shooting star, anything that's in the mint family, like Blophilia ciliata. These plants do not have dormancy requirements. So you can store them dry and you can sow them in the autumn. You can sow them in the wintertime. You can sow them the next spring and they will come up. All right, autumn ripening seeds. Now, when it comes to autumn ripening seeds, a lot of these plants are summer blooming plants, summer or autumn blooming plants that then ripen in the autumn. But there are some spring blooming plants that actually hold on to their seeds all summer long and do not ripen until autumn. And that includes Zizia aurea, which I'll talk about again later on. But Zizia aurea, spring blooming plant, but the seeds don't ripen in the summertime the way a lot of other spring blooming things do. They ripen in September, October. Collect them then. You can store them dry. You can sow them in the autumn. Milkweeds. There's a lot of species of milkweed. Spring blooming milkweeds like Asclepias exaltata or Asclepias quadrifolia. These milkweeds are still ripening their seeds in the autumn. And so you can still collect them in the autumn and sow them in the autumn or early winter. All of the asters of various kinds, Eurybia divaricata, white wood aster, so many of them. Again, you can collect them just about any time. A lot of the asters don't have dormancy requirements. So you actually can just store them dry through the winter and sow them in the spring. I usually give them a cold dormancy anyway, just in case. You can never be 100% sure whether or not these seeds are going to want a cold dormancy or not. Some of them seem to behave differently every time I collect them and sow them. So it's sometimes a little bit unpredictable. Actea racemosa, black cohosh. This is a double dormant plant. So this is a plant you collect it and you sow it in the autumn, and they will not germinate until the second spring after sowing. Monarda clinipodia, basil balm, all of the bee balms, like I said, anything that's in the mint family, generally speaking, no dormancy requirement. Also, a lot of them have very long shelf lives. That's another interesting thing. Leaving aside legumes, which is kind of their own special category, that is beans and things like that. The smaller the seed, the longer it seems to have a shelf life for. I've had bee balm germinate after 3 or 4 years in storage. Seems to do just fine. Anything that's fluffy, like asters and andropogon and things like that, that stuff usually loses viability very quickly. Only 1 year viability on most of those plants. Legumes, any bean, basically those plants last forever. Most of them don't have a cold dormancy requirement, and most of them you can store dry for 100 years, 1,000 years, and they'll still germinate. Penstemon hirsutus, all the penstemons, very easy to collect. You know, kind of hit or miss in terms of how long you can sit on these seeds. They do have a cold dormancy requirement, but I've sown second 2-year-old seed and still had pretty good germination on this. Here's Scutellaria incana. Now, as opposed to Scutellaria serrata that I showed you earlier, this one ripens all of their seeds all at the same time. So I can go out there with one bag, grocery bag, paper grocery bag, and collect them all at once, which is really convenient for Scutellaria incana. The gentians. Gentians often get a reputation for being difficult to germinate. If you look at like Prairie Moon's website, their germination code is like D difficult or whatever it is. But in fact, I actually find them pretty easy. The main thing with gentians is that the seeds are very small and very papery. You cannot bury them at all. But even though you can't bury them, neither do you want them just sitting on the surface of your soil exposed, because they'll blow away, or the rain water or your watering can water will move them around. So the thing with the success rate I've had with gentians is make sure your potting soil is very tightly packed so the seed doesn't work its way down into the soil too deep. Sprinkle the gentian seed, and this goes for any tiny seeded plant, anything that has seed that's like dust. Sprinkle it right on the surface of the soil. And then the only thing I put over the top of that seed is a little bit of dry sand, very fine sand. Or if you can get it, milled sphagnum, dry milled sphagnum, that works as well. Just a very thin layer. of dry sphagnum moss, just enough to cover the seeds over. That allows for a good seed soil contact without burying the seed, and they won't germinate if they don't have like almost 100% exposure to sunlight. Heuchera americana, another one with tiny, tiny little seeds that I also treat in the same way. Heuchera villosa, same thing. Thaspium and Zizia, both, like I mentioned earlier, both spring blooming plants that have autumn ripening seeds. And then those seeds that produce fruits in the autumn. Again, I mentioned persimmons, I mentioned pawpaws, but of course there's a lot of other ones like giant Solomon seal, like spikenard, the Oralia racemosa. These things, I usually process them in a blender to separate the seed from the pulp, or I'll just mash them in a bowl of water and strain the water and the pulp off and get the seeds that collect at the bottom. Any seeds that float, by the way, are bad generally. So the only seeds that are important when you're processing them in water is whatever collects at the bottom of the bowl of water. And then those seeds can be packed in wet sand, put in plastic bags and put in the refrigerator. Or since it's autumn, oftentimes I'll just sow them right into a seed flat and leave the seed flat out all winter. Complex dormancies. I mentioned a few of them already. These are plants that usually have 2 or more winters required for germination. Actea pachypoda, Camasia, clematis, but only the herbaceous clematis species. All of our woody clematises have a simple dormancy. So if you have something like Clematis viorna, which is a herbaceous clematis, they are double dormant. The lilies. Now, lily's odd because technically they do germinate after 1 winter. It's just that you don't notice it because they only germinate the root. It's the 2nd winter that germinates the top. For all lilies that point down, that's the case. For any lily that points up, it's a simple dormancy. All you have to do is sow them in the autumn, they germinate and come up next spring. So lilies that point down, double dormant. Lilies that point up, simple dormancy. There's Lilium superbum, and now another down-facing lily, so double dormant. Melanthium virginicum, almost all of the lily relatives or close lily relatives are double dormant, which is what this is. Now, I actually have a few plants that are triple or quadruple dormant. And this is the most notorious one, Triosteum auranticum, the wild coffee. Sometimes it's also called horse gentian or fever root. And this plant requires 3 or 4 years to germinate. Only one time have I ever had this germinate after a single winter time. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out what I did differently. I've tried everything on this. I've tried sulfuric acid. I've tried extracting the embryos from it. Nothing. I've tried sandpaper. Nothing seems to work to speed it up. So some of these things just require patience. Sowing, some things on sowing. This is actually my potting media. It's not really that relevant to this lecture, but I thought I'd put out there some of the materials that I use. And I like to have them on hand anyway, even for seed sowing, because oftentimes I'm adding a little bit of extra coarseness to whatever I'm buying for seed sowing. So the upper left-hand corner is like a typical basic seed growing mix. And then I'll usually add a little bit of extra bark or sand or something just to add a little extra drainage. Because one of the things I've noticed about most commercial seed starting materials is that they're too wet. They hold too much water. They don't drain well enough. But neither do you want a coarse potting mix like you would for a mature plant. So you want something a little finer generally, and that's where like coarse sand comes in. Or on the left-hand side, that's soil conditioner. which is basically very finely ground pine bark. And that works really well as an additive to a typical growing mix. Other things that I find useful or not useful, the sand I've mentioned already. Make sure you use coarse building sand. Never use playground sand. Playground sand is too fine. Use playground sand and it actually will clog up the drainage. It will cause the opposite of what you're trying to do. I have almost completely moved away from using peat in all applications except for seed germination. Peat is still, in my experience, the best material for seed propagation, and some plants won't propagate in anything else. They have to have that thick, moist, waterlogged, and acidic soil in order to germinate very properly. I've tried coir, which is that next material on the right, as a substitute for peat, but I found an awful lot of plants that I grow dislike growing in coir, especially the woodland plants. The lower left-hand corner is perlite, but it's very finely screened perlite that I will sometimes add to mixes to increase drainage, but I prefer sand generally, mainly because perlite is so dusty and I can't imagine that it's particularly healthy to use. I don't really care for it. Other additives I like to have around: bags of pure compost, like leaf compost. Don't use cow manure. I never use cow manure in seed sowing, but nicely rotted leaf mulch. A little bit goes a long way. A little bit added to the soil is often the only thing I'm putting in for any kind of fertilizer for the seed flats. A touch of plant tone can't hurt, but you have to be very careful. If you over fertilize a seed flat, you will actually get what salt buildup on the surface of the soil, and that will actually restrict germination. This is my homemade seed starting mix. So for anyone who's interested. And also, just for laughs, here's the potting mix that I use in my actual nursery production. So after the seedlings have grown out for a little while and I separate them out from my seed flats, they will go individually into quart or gallon pots with this mix. All right, thoughts on what you should sow your seeds into. Now, in the upper left-hand corner is the typical seed flat you can get at any garden center. They're often very flimsy. I don't like them for their flimsiness because I'm usually sowing my seeds in the wintertime for spring germination. And that flimsiness means that they have a tendency to get damaged over the winter, or the flimsiness, when I pick them up, the soil will actually cracks will open up in the soil. Now, I actually found some very, very rigid ones that are offered for sale on the Greenhouse Megastore website. They're so rigid that two people can hold one and a third person can stand in it. And I have actually liked those rigid ones quite a lot. And they last year after year, whereas those flimsy ones, often a year or two, and they're so busted and broken, I have to throw them away. So I do like the rigid ones I've been able to find. Even then, I will usually put a flat carrier under it. It just helps improve the rigidity and carrying capacity of those flats. On the right-hand side, that's an Anderson tree band flat. It's usually used in tree production, but I find that it makes a perfect seed sowing flat. It's not too big, it's not too small, it's fairly lightweight, it's nice and deep. Works great even for deep-rooted things like pawpaws or oak trees. The downside to those things is they're extremely expensive. You have to have them shipped out from Oregon, which is the only place that produces them. So the shipping often costs as much as the tray. And on the lower left-hand corner is a typical plug tray. And I recycle a lot of plug trays because I do buy in plugs from time to time, and I'll just sterilize and reuse the plug trays. I don't like them that much because I do find it hard to keep the soil perfectly balanced in terms of moisture, not too wet, not too dry with seed flats. The main advantage with a seed flat, though, is that if you get damp off, it won't spread across your whole seed tray like it will in a lot of other things. Damp off is a disease that can just destroy a seed flat. So that is one advantage with plug tray, but generally I don't like to use them. You can also make your own. On the top there, that's a wooden seed flat that I made with wood. And two advantages that come with a wooden seed flat. One of which I'll tell you now, and the other one I'll show you in a minute. The advantage that I'm demonstrating here is that you can staple hardware cloth onto it. So you can sow things like acorns into this, hazelnuts, and you don't have to worry about squirrels digging them up later. The tray on the bottom is a styrofoam tray. That's actually a grape shipping container that I got out of the trash from a grocery store. So grocery stores used to ship grapes and other damageable produce in these styrofoam containers, and they make perfectly acceptable seed sowing trays. And you're rescuing them from the trash for a little while. I mean, they go to trash eventually. And on the right-hand side, that's just a 3-gallon pot that I took a carpet knife to and cut in half. And actually that works just fine for sowing seeds in, which I like to use if I have a very, very small amount of seed and I don't want to put it in a big tray. I'll just use one of my cut down 3-gallon pots. And you want a nice, thick, rigid pot. No sense in using a flimsy pot. The other reason why it's useful to have a wooden flat is because some seeds germinate better with fire. And I don't really need this tray, this one here. But anyway, this is a wooden flat that I'm brought into the nursery, brought into the greenhouse in the springtime. I'm wetting it down a little bit with a hose. This is actually a different tray. And in this case, it's a styrofoam tray that I built a wooden frame to sit inside, but it's the same idea. But you put the wooden tray in there, and then I sprinkle pine needles across the surface of the soil, and I light it on fire. And I think, let's see if I can get this to play. Play. I don't know why I can't sometimes get videos to play on here. All right, if this had actually played, you would see a hand reach in with a match and just light that up with fire. A lot of plants, it's not actually the fire that makes them germinate better, it's the soot that washes into the soil after the burning goes across. New Jersey tea, I find, germinates almost 100% after doing this. The Eriogonum allenii, the shale-bearing buckwheat I talked about earlier, also germinates better after the fire. Does not damage the seed, at least not if you've sown them properly. It's a very, very small and quick fire. And again, it's really mainly the idea that I'm getting some fresh ash and soot washing into it that seems to spur the germination. And there's the seeds coming up in another tray afterwards. That's just showing the wooden flat again with the hardware mesh tacked onto it. These trays are actually ones like trilliums that I collected in July and cleaned and sowed immediately. Like I said, you have to sow trillium seeds right away. So they went right into these flats, but a flat sitting open, exposed all summer long is prone to damage. It's prone to drying out. It's prone to all kinds of mishaps. Even a very hard summer storm or a hailstorm will damage the surface of the soil and might wash your seed away. So whenever I sow summertime flats like this, I will top dress the whole thing in an inch or so of white pine needles. And then I'll just slide them under a table somewhere out of the way. The white pine needles protect the surface of the soil. And they actually also peel away very easily. Like I wouldn't use sawdust or anything like that because that stuff's hard to get off the surface of the soil later on. Pine needles are easy to clean up, and that works really well. In terms of wintertime, I generally leave my seed flats out all winter. So I'll do all of my seed sowing in the autumn. I'll put them into a row. I'll cover those rows in pine needles and I'll leave them sit outside all wintertime long. And then in the springtime, I'll bring them into the greenhouse. Actually, late winter, like February, March is when I do this. I'll bring them into the greenhouse and let them warm up. This is my old greenhouse. This is the old Enchanter's Garden greenhouse. This is my new, more modern greenhouse. But you don't have to do this in a greenhouse. I have a greenhouse because it's useful to give these things a little bit of an early boost. So I actually have plants ready to sell earlier in the spring. So for me, it's more about making sure that the seeds and the plants are ready in a timely fashion. For other people, that's not as necessary a consideration. You can build something smaller, like a cold frame, or one of those little mini greenhouses works just fine. Or you can just leave them outside and let them germinate whenever they're ready. No reason why you can't do it according to the season. Just a few thoughts on asexual propagation. That is like root cuttings and divisions. Some plants really do better that way. It's very hard to propagate them otherwise. Mehania, the Meehan's mint, I've never even seen this plant produce seed. And some plants don't produce very much seed, like Phlox stolonifera is another one, produces very, very small amounts of seed. So in this case, root cuttings are really easy, or stem cuttings are the main way I propagate it. Or you can just take a stem and put a rock on top of it, and it'll root there, and then you can dig it up and transplant it later on. Iris cristata is another one. Actually, lately I've started growing Iris cristata from seed. It's very hard to collect Iris cristata seed. That is the main thing. But now that I've started doing it, I actually find I get pretty good success with the seed. But it's so easy to propagate this from cuttings also. Here's some old ones in just pots, and you can see that the stems are just coming out over the edge of the pot, and they're even starting to produce little roots. All I do is cut those off, stick them in a tray of perlite. They'll root within a few weeks, and then they can go right into pots. So a really easy way to root them. And in this case, I like to have a place to put them where they can be protected and where they can keep the humidity high. You could just cover this with plastic. That works on a small scale. I have a rooting chamber that I put them in. It's just a wooden chamber that's covered. I can put multiple trays in there. And just to open it up every so often and use a misting bottle to keep the humidity high. All right, I am done. So let's hear some questions. Thank you.
All right, that was great, Ian. Really appreciate all that wonderful information. Let me swing back here. We had several questions for you. So we'll start with earlier in your presentation, you were talking about the refrigeration and the storage of seeds. So there's a couple questions related to that.
Yeah.
So one is, what's your take on seeds being frozen? And is there a time where you would not recommend it, or is it okay to freeze them?
I'm not certain. I have never frozen them in a refrigerator. There is a technique called quick dormancy. I can't. All right, let me think here. It's the quick way to overcome dormancy using a refrigerator and freezer. So oftentimes if I'm storing seeds in a refrigerator, I need to make sure they're in there for 30 or 60 days, depending on the plant. But you can cut that time in half or even less by moving them from the refrigerator, putting them in the freezer for half a day maybe, and then putting them back in the refrigerator again. Move them back and forth for about a week or two, and then you can sow them. They should come up.
Mm.
I have had that technique told to me by a reputable propagator. But I've never tried it myself. And I've never put seeds in a freezer for the whole winter or for many months, mainly because freezers are smaller. I have a lot less storage space, and I never have any trouble with germination having them in the refrigerator. I suspect it's probably okay because the seeds that I leave outside all winter are getting frozen anyway. They're certainly freezing out in the wild. So I suspect they could take it unless there's something just a little bit weird or unusual about a freezer, an artificial freezer. I mean, many of them go through thaw cycles, which might not be great. I don't know. But I find a refrigerator perfectly acceptable.
Great.
Thank you. And you can skip the next question, Deb. That was mine as well because he answered it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Perfect. We had a listener wanted to know where they could legally, or where can you legally collect native seeds. I asked where she was located because that could vary from state to state or county to county, but if you can kind of give a general comment to that question.
If you're not getting them from your own property, legally, you can collect them anywhere as long as you have permission. That permission can come from another landowner, a state, or the federal government, depending, so long as those laws hold. So yeah, usually I collect most of my stuff off my own property now because I've had this stuff for, for 20, 30 years at this point. Otherwise, states have different rules from different areas. West Virginia is generally pretty lax. Virginia is generally pretty lax. Others are a little bit stricter about getting permissions. It's always a good idea to get permission if you can. Federal government is very hard. I would say you're never going to get permission unless you're like a research associate or a major botanic garden or something. So yeah, I've never even bothered to try to get federal permissions. So
More challenging.
there are some public areas that I feel are gray zones. I have no compunction against taking seeds from the side of a road or from a power line right away, because those sites are often herbicided sooner or later.
Or
so as far as I'm concerned, that's free game because those plants are all walking dead.
Yeah, good point. All right, so this is about when to plant seed trays. So the person is AD had indicated we cold stratified a dozen species for our pollinator garden this November. It'll be 2 months in the refrigerator. We have a greenhouse facilities where they would like to pop up these seeds before Christmas break. Will that work, that timeline?
Yeah, professional nurseries will do that all the time. They're often germinating their plants very early, so that they're exactly ready in the spring. Now, in my experience, the downside to that is you end up with these hothouse plants that aren't cold hardy. So you sell them to somebody in April, and the first time there's a frost, they just melt away. I can't tell you how often I've seen people selling butterfly milkweed in bloom in April. And I'm like, so I do give my plants a jump, but I'm very cautious not to jump too much. Like I said, I usually start doing my heating up of the greenhouse in February, expecting good germination and growth in March, with division and potting happening in April, with those plants being ready to sell in May. That's my timeline that I prefer. Others, some of them will actually do this work in December, and they'll actually very carefully cold acclimatize their plants, but that's a lot of work. And it's more work than I'm willing to do. But if you're willing to put it in, you could definitely do it that way too.
Yeah, yeah. Good. So I know we're at the end of the talk and I have a couple more questions. So if you're open to a couple more, Ian, we'll keep going for a few more
You
minutes.
can keep going.
All right. And those that need to drop off, I will say very quickly that I did post some links, one to Ian's contact info, and then also places where you can go and rewatch the presentation, and then it will also be sent out to everyone that did register. So are there any tips that you have on doing bulk seed starting in the refrigerator? They've seen it or done it only in small quantities in paper towels.
Bulk. Well, I mean, bulk is a relative word. I've done what I would call bulk in sand or in paper towels in the refrigerator, and really the only limitation is how much room are you willing to dedicate your refrigerator to seeds?
Yeah.
It's really just comes down to space and how much time and work you have to put into it.
Mm.
The
Yeah.
more seed you have, especially with the paper towel method, you can only put so much seed on a paper towel and still get good moist contact with it. So you do end up having to use multiple paper towels or something like that, multiple bags if you do it that way. Yeah. And if the seed is anything bigger than Baptisia seed, I prefer sand. I only use paper towels as a last resort because paper towels, some seeds are very hard to get off the paper towel later on. And no matter how much you try, paper towels often get moldy. Doesn't really hurt the seeds necessarily, but it kind of gets gross to work with. So
Yeah, I've actually had that problem. And then I ended up just putting the paper towel on top of the dirt and then put some dirt on top of it and thought, oh, it'll go. So
these days, generally, if it's tiny little seeds, I just sow them in the tray and leave them outside. I don't even try to do it in the refrigerator.
Same
The
here.
refrigerator I reserve for milkweeds and pawpaws and anything, Baptisia even, and all of that seed can go into sand because it's really easy to see. You can separate it from the sand later if you want to. So yeah,
Okay.
that's the way I do that.
Good. For someone attempting to propagate native seeds for the first time, is there a plant or possibly a couple plants that you recommend starting with that tend to be fairly easy and you have a pretty good success rate for them to learn and then be excited that actually they have grown something from seed?
Sure. Hard to pick any general. I mean, of course, the easiest seeds are to germinate are the ones that have no dormancy requirement. So any native annual like black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta, or partridge pea, or really any legume like Baptisia, all of them germinate relatively easily just by sowing them in the spring. Baptisia is maybe a little hit or miss. Some Baptisia, depending on how old the seed is, might go into a deeper dormancy, require a little longer. But those are generally pretty easy ones, especially Rudbeckia hirta or Rudbeckia triloba. They don't really have any dormancy. If you want to have the extra challenge of having a dormant plant that needs the cold or simple dormancy, again, I would choose something, maybe not a small seed that's a little bit more difficult, but something moderately sized, like Heliopsis or Echinacea or something like that. A decent sized seed, really easy to handle. So.
Okay,
That's what I would go with.
good deal. I'll finish with one last question, although there are a couple more that have come through. I know someone had asked for you to reshare your growing medium recipes. You can either bring that up real quick in the presentation if that's too much trouble.
No.
To Shelley, I think we could Yep, there we go. We'll flip through
Which
that.
one did they want? The
I'm
seed
not
or
sure
the?
which one. She said the seed starting, so I would say probably
Oops,
just
why did
do
it go
the
right to the
first
end?
one that you brought up and maybe even the second.
All right, I'll leave that one up for a few seconds.
All right. And then you might flip to the, I think you had 2 slides on that one. Go to both.
That's the potting mix that I use.
Yeah. So what I will do, there were a couple more questions, Bill, Daniels, I'll turn it back to you so we can wrap up. And Ian, again, thank you so much for your presentation. Great, a lot of great questions.
Mhm.
And thanks again. Bill?
Here I come. I clicked on it and it was coming up and I clicked again. But thanks so much, Ian. That was really great. I've got a lot of notes. I'll rewatch it again. I know one of the seeds that I was trying really to collect was the Jeffersonia diphylla, the twin leaf,
Yep.
and it was a huge population, an area that I had permission to collect from, and I was going there weekly, just and I went, came back the next week. They were all gone. The whole population had dropped all at once.
Yeah, they'll
And
do that.
yeah,
Now that one actually, there is a little trick you can do. If
yeah,
you
I'd like
take
to
your
know it.
thumb and just kind of pinch it a little bit, if it pops, they're already.
Okay, okay. I'll remember that for next spring. That's excellent. But let me get some notes here. I had them up, but we'll go ahead and wind up the meeting now. But if you have any additional questions regarding the presentation or native seed communities, feel free to reach out to us at the links that Deb provided. We invite you to also join our Facebook group. Pictures and your propagation videos or whatever are quite welcome. And also, if you're doing this with an organization, we'd love to hear how your group is doing, because that's one of the key things about native seed communities is the encouragement of groups of people collecting those seeds together, processing them together, sowing them together. We're getting ready to do that, for instance, at Sycamore Land Trust in a couple of weeks. So anyway, we'd love to see how your propagating is going. If you're interested in learning more about native plants and propagation in your region, your area, we invite you to join if you aren't already. To be a member, especially for our Indiana folks of the Indiana Native Plant Society. We've got chapters throughout the state, and we would love to have you be a part of our activities. So thanks again, Ian, for your
Yes, thank
informative
you.
presentation. Really appreciated it. Deb, as always, thanks for all your help and for ably taking care of the questions and all. And thank you to all of you that have joined us. It was good to see you. We'll sign off for now and have fun growing native plants from seed.
All
Bye-bye
right, thank
all.
you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.